see there. Hurricane Katrina was a Category 5 hurricane that formed on the 23rd of August 2005. It was one of the costliest natural disasters in US history, with over $108 billion in property damage alone. It was thought that at least 1,836 people died in this hurricane, with over 80% of New Orleans flooded.
A tropical cyclone forms by the warm air over an ocean heated to 27 degrees Celsius to a sufficient depth, condensing to form clouds by releasing its latent heat into the air. This warm air then rises to form columns of clouds. This process happens many times over until a small cluster of thunderstorms has been formed.
As the storm grows larger, the air at the top of the column cools and warms the air around, increasing the pressure at the top, causing air to move away. This movement reduces surface pressure.
The air at the surface then moves toward low pressure areas, creating thunderstorms and increasing wind speeds to 61 km an hour. Due to the low pressure nature of the storm, the air begins to move anti-clockwise in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern hemisphere. It is not until the wind speeds reach 119 km an hour that is officially a tropical warming cyclone.
Hurricane Katrina brought winds of up to 271 km an hour sustained and gusts of over 300 km per hour. This brought high rain, heavy wind speeds, risk of debris and a 9-metre storm surge, which caused some of the following impacts.
80% of New Orleans was underwater to a depth of 7 to 8 metres.
Major highways were disrupted and some bridges were destroyed.
Over 1 million housing units were damaged in the Gulf Coast region.
Insurance companies paid an estimated $41.1 billion on 1.7 million claims for damages.
Thousands of businesses destroyed, as well as thousands of jobs and millions in tax incomes.
$2.5 to $5 billion in local economic damages, according to the Louisiana Economic Department.
9-metre storm surge affected up to 200 miles of the Gulf Coast, including large cities.
The hurricane damaged nearly 475 oil and gas pipelines, spilling nearly as much oil as the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil disaster.
Large levels of beach erosion destroyed many beaches and some islands.
So a history of similar hurricanes that happened in the region was Hurricane Andrew in 1992 with wind speeds in excess of 282 km an hour. It was a Category 5 storm and created a storm surge of 5.2 metres. 63,000 homes were destroyed and more than 110,000 suffered significant damage. 65 people were killed and it cost $26.5 billion US. It's the third costliest hurricane after Katrina and Sandy. Hurricane Sandy happened in 2012 and that caused 147 deaths, damaged over 650,000 homes, 8.5 million people were left without power. It caused blizzards with over 3 feet high of snow and cost between 50 and 70 billion US dollars. And more similarly, Hurricane Matthew of this year, 2016, hit Florida, Georgia, North and South Carolina and Haiti. The deaths are still being reported, so there is no actual confirmed number. The winds were in excess of 195 km an hour. It caused a 3-metre storm surge and deposited 400 millimetres of rainfall.
So, Gregor, were there any particular sensitivities within the groups of people affected by Hurricane Katrina?
Well, it's well documented that the worst affected sector of the population were those in heavily poverty-hit areas. But it's been argued that it had been an issue of race. However, research did show that those who were able to evacuate safely were those living in the affluent areas with the resources required for such an event. Despite this, however, there was a clear distinction between the proportion of white privilege in the areas of affluence and the high prevalence of black people in the poverty-stricken zones. It was also well noted by the Louisiana Department of Health and Hospitals that a large percentage of the 200,000 people who stayed in New Orleans during the Hurricane Katrina did so due to the unavailability of resources. Those of a lower socio-economic standard tended to live in the most polluted, least secure and highest risk areas, and it's been suggested that the poorer neighbourhoods received less protection than those with more money. So, for example, the poorer structural quality of the housing available to the lower income poverty-hit people was more likely to collapse during the disaster. and this was evident during Katrina, as the worst affected areas were the low-lying land, which were heavily black and poor.
So, were there any particular issues associated with the organisations involved in Katrina?
Well, in general, most of the organisations affiliated with a specific goal were able to perform the task. However, in order to work together well, there was a series of networks within the city that were set up. So the issue with these networks in the long run was that many of them were overlapped from one task to another, and this meant that there were basic issues with coordination and disagreements on how to respond to specific issues that were posed. An example of this is the responsibility of who was to collect and remove the dead bodies. So FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, they pushed for the government to take charge, but the state officials were overwhelmed and ended up blaming FEMA for the delays in body recovery, and therefore this led to a backlog of responses, meaning that the overall activity took far longer than it should have had it been properly organised.
So, Elliot, were there any vulnerability issues associated with the environmental side of Hurricane Katrina?
In terms of why New Orleans is vulnerable to flooding, this is because the city was built on the lower lying land between the bank of the Mississippi River and the shoreline of Lake Pontchartrain. As well as this, the wetlands of the Mississippi Delta have diminished in size, therefore reducing protection from flooding. This is due to them being starved of sediment because of such heavy embankments along the Mississippi, causing less erosion upstream and ultimately less deposition downstream. This then means that the floodplain for the river is smaller, forcing the floodwater to head towards the city in a flood event.
To aid relief operations, more than 10,000 Army personnel and Air National Guardsmen, as well as 7,200 active duty troops, were stationed in the Gulf Coast region for several weeks after the storm. 8 new observation buoys have been placed in the Atlantic Ocean and Gulf Coast area to aid the prediction of hurricanes. Over 220 miles of flood walls and levees along the Mississippi River and some coastal areas around New Orleans were strengthened to reduce the risk of flooding in the area. Over 10,000 homes have been made available to house the displaced families after the storm. Around $16.7 billion have been made available for the rebuilding and reconstruction of damaged structures. As well as this, over $1.3 million has been invested into new hurricane broadcasting systems. Over 500,000 people received medical help from the Red Cross in the days following the storm. As well as this, the Red Cross also provided 826,000 people with psychological help in the weeks following the storm. During the storm, the Coast Guard, police, fire service, army, and numerous volunteers rescued over 50,000 people. Immediately after the storm, around 25,000 people were given temporary shelter at the sports stadium, the Louisiana Superdome. The short-term response can be defined as the return of vital life support systems to a minimum operating standard. For example, the cleanup, the provision of temporary housing, or the provision of clean water. Long-term responses may continue for several years after the disaster. Their purpose is to return life to normal or even improved levels. For example, this can be done through redevelopment loans, legal assistance, and community planning.
One of the economic outcomes for Katrina is a dramatic increase in startup businesses. The reason for the increase is entrepreneurs providing services such as debris removal and construction. Even 10 years on, the startup rate is 64% higher than the national average. The majority of these new startups come under the social entrepreneurship category, meaning their goal is to provide a service for the community rather than profit.
With
Before Katrina, the Louisiana wetlands acted as a natural buffer to hurricanes, reducing their effects. However, over the last 70 years, those wetlands have been rapidly disappearing. It was clear after Katrina that something had to be done, so that the state created a Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. The agency immediately put in place plans to repair damage caused by poor urban planning, natural subsidence and pipeline construction. The US Army Corps of Engineers diverted the Mississippi River to rebuild and sustain the wetlands.
A new levee system has also been put in place, as when Katrina hit, the current levees were eroding and had sunk 2 feet below their original height due to unstable soil. So the new levees had increased height. The shape was changed from I-shaped walls to T-shaped and L-shaped walls, which provide extra stability. They now have steel support beams which go 65 feet below sea levels. The pump systems, which gets flood water from the streets into nearby lakes, failed during Katrina, and so there has been a lot of work done into these to reduce the flooding damage.